Hello everyone. For today, we are going to talk about Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Okay, I think Freud's name is familiar to you, and let me use this opportunity for me to talk about the details of his theory of personality so that you'll be able to understand yourself better from the perspective of Sigmund Freud. Okay, so let us begin. Okay, so Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is not just a theory of personality, it is also a theory of therapy. Now, when we say psychoanalysis, it believes in the power of the unconscious in determining our day to day behavior. And Freud is one of those who explained that our day to day behavior has a lot to do with our unconscious. Hence, the big part of our personality is unknown to us because it's not conscious, but rather it's deep down in the unconscious. So that's his proposed theory. So, other than that, there are other theories in psychology, and most of the theories in the psychodynamic perspective were made based on Freud's psychoanalysis or as variants of it. In other words, there are also other theories that emerged during his time, such as Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Horney, Klein, and the others, and their theories were made in order to support Freud's view or to contradict his view, particularly because Freud gave more importance to men over women. That's why he had a lot of critics, especially those who are feminists. They criticize him for not being able to understand psychology of women. All right, so now, what's the difference between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic? When we say psychoanalysis, we are just talking about Freud, but when we talk about psychodynamic, we are talking about a family of theories. This is like a tradition in psychology wherein all psychodynamic theories have a common ground, and that is they give importance either to childhood or to unconscious. And thanks to Freud for that, he inspired them in their theory, giving importance to either childhood or the unconscious. So now let's start. Another thing that makes Freud theory unique is that he believes that we all of us have two drives or two instincts, and these are eros and thanatos, which means sex and aggression. So Freud believed that everything we do comes from either sexual drive or aggressive behavior. Okay, so everything that you do, they can be limited into two. That is either sexual or aggressive. However, it's important for me to clarify what sexual means because during their time, people were conservative. They don't openly talk about it. That's why Freud believed that perhaps we are motivated to seek sexual behavior or sexual pleasure. However, as time goes by, Freud would like to clarify that it is not really the act of sexual intercourse or sexual behavior, but rather everything pleasurable is under eros. So even though it's not sexual, but it's pleasurable, it's already considered eros. That's why basically Freud is saying that we are born to look for pleasure or sometimes to be aggressive. Okay, just like animals. So, in other words, Freud is believing that because of eros, we search for food, we search for water, we want to relax, and we want different types of joy in life, particularly those that are pleasurable. But there are times wherein we can be aggressive, and he believed that people can be aggressive because his daughter died after the war. That's why Freud believed that people have the capacity to be aggressive towards other people. Okay, is the first one to make a structured theory about the unconscious. And what is the unconscious? We are not so aware that we have an unconscious because unconscious is something that you don't observe in your day to day life. Unconscious is something hidden from your senses, but it continues to motivate you, it continues to affect you. Some people may say that they think that their unconscious is manipulating them. Now, according to Freud, the unconscious contains all the drives, urges, or instincts that are outside our awareness. Meaning, there are a lot of ideas that we are not aware of because we are unconscious about these ideas. They are in the unconscious. And what are the ideas that are in the unconscious? Most of the time, the ideas that are in the unconscious are those that are so threatening for us to accept them. That's why we put them in the unconscious, or In other words, we try to forget them. For example, anger towards your parents. Of course, you don't want to live with anger towards them. That's why you put them in the unconscious. Sexual desires, sexual impulses, unhealthy beliefs, fears, those are some things that you would put in the unconscious. Also, you will have some shameful experiences. That's why there are people who had shameful experiences and they don't want to talk about it. Why? Because it's in the unconscious, and they don't want to talk about it because they are ashamed of talking about it. Other than that, another thing that can be in the unconscious is the possibility of being abused. So there are a lot of people who grow up and they didn't remember that they were sexually or physically abused as a child, because such experiences are so threatening. That's why we put them in the unconscious. So that's like the storehouse of unacceptable ideas, beliefs, etc. So even though we're not aware of these beliefs, of these ideas, it continues to motivate us in our day-to-day behavior. Other than that, we also have what we call preconscious. So the difference between preconscious and the unconscious is that it's easier for us to recall the ideas that are in the preconscious. And when we say preconscious, they contain our ideas that we are not aware of, but we can be aware of these ideas easily or with some effort, with some difficulty. For example, your birthday, for example, our lesson yesterday, those are the things that you are not thinking about right now, but if I ask you to recall them, you can easily recall them. But if we ask a person to recall about the details of the person who raped or abused him or her, then it would be harder because it's in the unconscious, because that's so threatening. Okay? And right now, you are in your consciousness, because when we say consciousness, that is the collection of what you see, what you hear, what you feel, and these three are connected to each other, because an unconscious idea will try its best to be conscious. That's why we become anxious from time to time. We become afraid. For example, why are we afraid of person A? Perhaps because person A reminds us of a person that we are not in good terms with. For example, person A reminds us of our parent, and we are not so close with the parent these days. Perhaps there was a conflict back in childhood, or there was a family problem. And there are a lot of other examples. Okay, so now let's take a look at the contents of your unconscious, preconscious, and consciousness. For example, the things that will be in the unconscious are the selfish desires. For example, you just want to do something for yourself, then that's something that you don't that is unacceptable. Hence, if something is unacceptable in the society, we try to hide them in the unconscious. Immoral urges or violent motives. For example, because of your anger, you want to kill or hurt someone, then that's not a healthy idea to have. That's why we put them in the unconscious. And then fears. Of course, if you are afraid of a certain person, if you're afraid of a certain animal, you also put them in the unconscious. And irrational wishes, shameful experiences, and unacceptable sexual desires. That's why these things, even though we're not aware of them, they continue to find their way into our day-to-day life. That's why we are anxious and we cannot explain why we are anxious. It's because the explanation is coming from the unconscious. Sometimes there are patients in therapy wherein they would say that, I don't know, but I'm angry towards my teacher. I can't explain why am I angry to him or her. He has done nothing bad to me. And then a psychodynamic psychotherapist will typically say something like, perhaps the teacher remind you of someone from your childhood. You told me earlier about the characteristics of your father. Isn't that very similar to the characteristics of your teacher? So now you can be aware why you're angry towards your teacher. It's because you have memory. The presence of the teacher is triggering certain memories from your unconscious. Okay, and in the preconscious we have memories of facts and stored knowledge, and in the consciousness that's what you're thinking right now, and that's what you're feeling right now, what you're sensing through your five senses and others. Okay, so things from the unconscious and the preconscious will try to find their way going to consciousness. And it's so difficult for an idea to make its way through consciousness because there's a reason why they are in the unconscious. It's because they are unacceptable. So if they are going to find their way through consciousness, it will result to some kind of anxiety. Okay, later we will talk about how can we deal with anxiety. For example, if you remember an instance wherein you were embarrassed, then that is very anxiety provoking. You are ashamed that you are ashamed of what happened in the past. That's why when you remember something embarrassing, you don't feel so good. And later we will talk about the other types of anxiety and how to deal with them according to Sigmund Freud. Okay, other than that, Freud also proposed that there are three provinces of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is the pleasure principle. So that's the part of your mind that will tell you to do this. And don't think about other people. Don't listen to your parent. I know you want to do this. Okay, so it is represented by the devil. Okay, it's the devil in you. It's the one telling you to pursue what you want to pursue what you want to do, or to keep on doing what brings you pleasure without thinking about its consequences. So perhaps it's the reason why there are people who take substances, who are engaged in alcoholism, and then they don't realize the consequences of their behavior. So they are dominated by the devil in them, or in Freud's term, the id. Other than that, we also have the ego. So that's you, that's the ego. And the ego is the one responsible in selecting between the demands of the id and the superego. So that's your role. You're the one who would select which of the two would you obey. So you don't obey unrealistic demands, but rather you try to match their demand with what is possible in the reality. Other than that, so the superego is the moral or morality principle. It tells you what not to do. The development of the superego comes from the influence of our parents when they discipline us, or when they tell us the do's and don'ts. So now, here's my question to you. Freud would say that when we were born, only one of these three was present. And what is that? His answer was, we are born with the id. So it means that inherently, by default, we are dominated by the desire for pleasure. That's why we humans are so out of control if the ego and the superego will not emerge. That's why, analyzing what I told you about Freud, how did Freud see the human person? Are we born to be good, or are we born to be bad? For Freud, he thinks that we are born to be bad because he believes that all of us are born with the id instead of the ego and instead of the superego. So it's dangerous if you will grow up and you will not be able to have to have a well-developed superego, because your id will be the one dominating you. Okay, and other than that, Freud believed that the ego is not the master in his own house, but rather it's the id, because the devil is more powerful than either the ego or the superego. That's why it's very challenging for us to resist our desires. That's how Freud viewed the human person, and that's very pessimistic, because basically he's telling us that you are not in control over your own behavior. Okay, and if you want to control yourself, it would take a lot of effort. And how did Freud define the healthy person? For him, a healthy person is not dominated by the superego. He is also not dominated by the id, but rather a healthy person is the one with a dominant ego. It means that you don't follow the demands of your id all the time, meaning you know the limitations of your activities. You won't go to a party if you know that it would not be healthy for you anymore because you need to sleep. Okay? Other than that, you are not super ego dominated, meaning you are not the type of person who don't allow yourself to make mistakes, because a super ego dominated person is trying to be perfect all the time. He's trying to live a saintly life, trying to be free of mistakes. And I think that's just impossible. And it's hard to be controlled by your super ego, because basically there are things that you won't do just because you are always listening to your super ego, even though you need to do them. Okay, so you want your ego to be the dominant one instead of your super ego or your id. Okay, so here are example situations. So if a person is a conservative person, then he or she would be dominated by the superego. But if the person is someone who doesn't care, someone who just pursue what he wants, doesn't think about the consequences, then that person is dominated by the id. Okay? So in order, when we were born, First, we have the id, followed by the ego, and then followed by the superego. So it's the last one that develops. So Freud believed that anxiety happens because there is conflict between the ego and the id. Okay, there can also be conflict between the ego and the superego, or there can also be conflict between the ego and the reality. So it's hard for the ego to balance the demands of the id, the superego, and even the reality. So what is the meaning, sir, of conflict between the ego and the reality? It means that there's a real threat in front of you. For example, if there's a tiger in front of you, that's a conflict between yourself and the reality. That's why it tells you that you have to run, or it results to anxiety. Okay, so the meaning of number three is that there is an actual danger that might happen in the reality. Okay, so in order to protect ourselves from anxiety, then we use some defense mechanisms. And now let's talk about those defense mechanisms according to Sigmund Freud. Okay, so we use defense mechanisms in order to protect ourselves from anxiety. Now, what are these defense mechanisms? And I hope that this discussion will allow you to be aware of your day to day behavior, and you will now understand that these defense mechanisms results from the different types of anxiety that we feel. Okay, for example, now let's look at repression. So when we say repression, that is the unconscious act of keeping threatening thoughts, feelings, or impulses out of the consciousness. So it's used if the threat is coming from inside. Here's an example of repression. Typically, if a person has been sexually abused or physically abused when he or she was a child, he would typically say when he is now an adult, or she is now an adult, that he or she doesn't recall anything that occurred during childhood. So even though there's a proof that abuse really happened, they would typically say that they don't remember anything. Why? Because that's a fact that's very hard to accept, and we try to repress them. Hence, you repress or you unconsciously forget things that you don't want to recall. And what are the other things that we repress? For example, um, perhaps there were some of you had family issues when you were younger. For example, you were envious towards your sibling. That's why you don't want to see your sibling anymore, or perhaps you have a death wish towards someone. That's not a desirable idea, or that's a bad idea. That's why we try to repress them into the unconscious. Now, here's another example of unconscious. When there's a hold up situation, and then we're going to interview the victim. How can you recall the appearance of the suspect? Can you recall the appearance of the criminal? Typically, they would say that they cannot recall anything because the things happen so quickly. Freud would say that that is repression, because that is a bad memory. You try to repress it. That is related, but it's different to what we call denial, because in denial, it's refusal to accept the unpleasant reality. So you would see that it's connected, but how does it differ, sir? Look at this. In repression, it is used if the threat is coming from inside, but in denial, it is used if the threat is coming from outside. Meaning, in repression, the threat may be your own personal memories. That's why you don't want to talk about them. For example, bad relationships, you try to repress them. That's why you say that I don't want to talk about that anymore. But in denial, you use that perhaps in connection with repression, or you use that if the threat is coming from outside. So what does that mean? Here's an example of denial. You know that you are alcoholic, but you keep on saying that you are not alcoholic. And how did that become denial? Because you can obviously see your behavior and yet you deny it. Here's another example. A person who is overweight in an unhealthy way may say that I don't believe that I'm overweight. I just like eating. Okay. I don't see any reason for me to diet. So that is denial, or they are closing their eyes to reality. So you may also deny to help your repression. Okay. So they may be connected to each other. Repression is the mother of all defense mechanism. The reason why we do the different defense mechanism is that we are trying to maintain the repression. Other than that, we also have projection. So when we say projection, it's a defense mechanism in which people deny ideas. So deny again. However, in projection, they also project them onto others. Here's an example of projection. For example, I'm mad. However, when we are arguing, I say to you that I'm not the one who's mad. It's you. So that is projection. Typically, that also happens in other types of feelings. For example, a person would say that I'm not the one attracted to you, but you're the one attracted to me. I'm not the one envious. You're the one who is very envious about me. So that is projection. So we try to point fingers. We don't want to be honest about our feelings. That's why we say that it's the other people who have these feelings. And when we say sublimation, on the other hand, that is a defense mechanism that involves expressing our impulses in a socially acceptable way. Meaning, remember that Freud believed that our unconscious is filled with sexual and aggressive ideas. What Freud is saying is that we try to make use of these drives, of these urges, instead of pursuing our sexual desires or our aggressive desires. What we do is that we channel our energy into something that is productive. Okay, because Freud believes that sex and aggression is the source of all our energy. However, instead of doing sexual or aggressive behaviors every day, what do we do every day? We study, or you work, you write, you draw, you tend to become productive. Basically, instead of being sexual or aggressive in our behavior, we try to channel our energy into something that will be useful for the society. So sublimation is the reason why you are going to school. Okay? So instead of using your energy to be aggressive or to be sexual, you're using that energy for you to do something that is very productive. Also, we have what we call reaction formation. So when we say reaction formation, that is a defense mechanism that occurs when an unpleasant idea, feeling, or impulse is turned into its opposite. For example, I've heard of cases of people who are angry towards their sibling, but as they grow older, they would say that anger turned into love. Another example of reaction formation is this. Typically, when our parents get mad, they would say that I'm mad at you because I care about you or because I love you. So that's reaction formation. Sometimes when we are shy about expressing our feelings, we try to turn it into opposite. That's why, for example, you may be angry towards your partner or towards your crush. For example, instead of being sweet, you try to express your feelings by being strict or by being angry. And that is reaction formation because we don't want to accept our feelings or we are shy about expressing our feelings. We also have rationalization, or we try to justify an acceptable behavior by giving some sort of logical explanation. For example, you when people are eating unhealthy food, they would say that I don't worry because eventually all of us will die. Or when they are very alcoholic, they might justify it by saying that it's okay because alcohol has health benefits, and that's true. However, I don't think that alcoholism would still be helpful if you are now addicted to the substance or the alcohol. Okay, here's another type of rationalization. For example, you're applying to a certain job but you get rejected. You would say something like, anyway, I did not plan to work on their company. I was just convinced by my friend to apply there. So that's rationalization, or in other words, you're trying to give an excuse about your behaviors. We also have what we call regression. So when we say regression, you are moving to an earlier stage of psychosexual development, meaning in regression, because the current stage is so challenging, you try to move to an earlier stage of your life. That's why when we scold people, people cry, or people lock themselves into their room, Freud would say that these are childish behavior. And we engage in childish behavior because we wish that we are children once again. So that's why when we are facing troubles, we engage in childish behaviors, or we try to be childish because we wish that we don't have these responsibilities today and we wish that we can be a child once again. So that is regression. And other than that, we have displacement. So what is displacement? In displacement, when you have tension such as hostility or fear, we try to take them out on a less threatening target. For example, if you're angry towards your teacher or towards your professor, then it would not be correct to express that anger towards your professor. That's why when you get home, you express your anger by hurting your pet, for example, your dog, or destroying things. You destroy those things because you know that you cannot express your anger towards your professor or towards your parent. That's why you channel your anger by expressing them towards other people or other objects. Okay, so that's why there are times wherein when you had a conflict with your parent, you try to express them to someone younger than you or sometimes to your partner because that's the only way for you to deal with your unexpressed emotion. Now let's talk about the psychosexual stages of Sigmund Freud, and the first one is the oral stage. Remember that for Freud, we are motivated to seek either sex or aggression. That's why his theory circles around searching for pleasure. So, in the oral stage or in the earliest part of our development, we try to get pleasure through the lips, or this is the part of the body that feels the pleasure. That's why children are more likely to engage in behaviors such as sucking, chewing, or swallowing, especially when they are being fed, because the lips is the part where they feel all the pleasure that they need. So it's the role of the parents in order for us to be able to go through this stage, and they will guide us through this stage. However, if they over gratify, which means that if they give too much or they under gratify, meaning they are absent when we need them, it will result to a fixation. And when we say fixation, you get stuck in a stage, which means that even though you are an adult now, you still have unresolved issues back when you were in childhood. Okay, so what would be a healthy development? A healthy development will not over gratify or under gratify the person, but rather it should be balanced. Meaning your parents should not give you so much attention because you will be spoiled, or your parents should not under gratify you, or they should be present when you need them. Now, what are the types of fixation that occurs in this stage? Okay, so your fixation will result to a certain character that you have now. For example, if you're fixated in the oral phase, you may have what we call an oral receptive character, meaning if your parent gave you too much attention in the oral stage because you're their baby or their one and only, if you're an only child, you have the tendency to be dependent to them or to be gullible, meaning you have the tendency to believe what other people are telling you because your parents have been kind to you, so you assume that everyone will be kind to you as well. Other than that, they can also be good listener. However, they can be an excessive eater, drinker, kisser, or smoker. Why? They have the tendency to keep on looking for the pleasure that they felt through their lips. Okay, so even though they are an adult now, they still look for pleasure through the lips, through these behaviors. Other than that, if your parents fail to give you enough attention at this stage, you may develop what we call oral sadistic character. So you have the tendency to be hostile, critical, envious, or exploitative, meaning that you always try to point out what's wrong with other people because your parents didn't give you enough attention when you were a child. That's why you are so envious of others, and you try to resolve that issue by pointing out what's wrong with other people or being hostile or critical to them. That's what makes you feel good, according to Sigmund Freud. After that, when you are now a toddler, you enter what we call the anal stage, meaning all the pleasure comes from the anus or the anus buttocks part of the body. So why did Freud believe that the pleasure is felt in the anus buttocks region? It's because during this stage he believed that our main goal is for us to learn how to control defecating, okay, or excretion. Okay, so in order we need to be able to control our ability to excrete waste from our body because as toddlers we need to master this behavior so that when we become an adult we won't be dependent to our parents. There's an important event called toilet training. That's why you can see individual differences, and Freud would say that it depends on their amount of toilet training. There are people who have not been trained how to handle themselves in the toilet, while there are people who know what to do when they are in the toilet when they were younger. That's why it results to certain characteristics until the present. And what are they? So there's what we call anal expulsive character, meaning they did not undergo good toilet training. That's why they're so messy or wasteful, or they have the capacity to be generous, meaning they don't know how to take care of themselves, so they also don't know how to take care of their things. That's why they have the tendency to be disorganized, or they have the tendency to easily let go of things because they don't know its value. We also have what we call anal retentive character. And when we say that you're anal retentive, you have been toilet trained so well to the point that you become very organized, to the point that you've become perfectionistic in everything that you do. Okay, so Freud would say that you're perfectionistic now because that's the attitude that your parents instilled in you even when you were still a toddler. So they are perfectionists. That's why you're also perfectionistic until today. So that's for the anal stage. Eventually, you will move on to what we call the phallic stage, and this is around 3 to 6 years of life. In the phallic stage, there are differences in the experiences of males and females. Let me stress this part of the theory. In the oral stage, you only have the id. In the anal stage, the ego develops, while in the phallic stage, this is where the superego develops. And since Freud is biased against women, he believed that the superego of boys is better in comparison to girls. And how was he able to reach that conclusion? Let's talk about that. First, Freud discussed the male Oedipal complex, or the Oedipal complex talks about attraction to the mother. If you want a refresher, then it might be beneficial for you to read the story of Oedipus the king once again. Okay? Now, Freud believed that at this stage, the child has a tendency to be jealous towards the father because the boy's first love is the mother. So he is envious towards the father. Also, other than that, he may feel what we call castration anxiety. Why? Freud believes that boys are afraid of their father because their father may find out that they are attracted to their mother. And the boys are afraid because they're afraid that they're going to be castrated, or their father may take their sex organ away from them because of their bad behavior. And that's the reason why the young boy will learn how to behave. So that's the reason why the superego develops. Okay, so that's the story of the boys according to Sigmund Freud. But now let's look at the story of the girls. Now, before I proceed to the story of the girls in the female Oedipal complex, let me remind you that Freud is biased against women because he didn't really understand the experience of women. Okay, now let's look at this. So, according to Freud, the girls become aware that she lacks a penis and blames the mother for its absence. Because for Freud, I don't know why he is so preoccupied with the male sex organ, but he believes that it's the symbol of superiority. Hence, because girls don't have this sex organ, women feel inferior towards men. And I know that you're going to disagree with me on that. That's why Freud had a lot of critics. Going back to Freud, he believed that the lack of the sex organ makes the girl blame the mother for bringing her into the world without the feeling of superiority. That's why the girl has a bad relationship towards the mother and she will be attracted towards the father. Okay, and other that's why the girl is close to the father. But other than that, if the boys feel what we call castration anxiety, according to Freud, girls feel what we call penis envy, or girls are envy, but his view is concrete. He believes that women are envious about the male sex organ. And asking my students before, they would like to express that they disagree with this belief of Sigmund Freud. So let's reinterpret it with the reality nowadays. Perhaps it's better to say that women were envious about the superiority or the dominance of men back then and not really the sex organ. I think that makes more sense. Okay, then eventually, after 3 to 6 years old, you will now go to school for your grade school, and that's the latency stage. And according to Freud, in the latency stage, the sexual drive is not that active because you are now busy with schoolwork. So what do we call that? You are now sublimating. So that's where you direct all your energy, okay, in learning things about the world. And then eventually, when you enter adolescence, you will go to what we call the genital stage, and your sexual drives are active once again. However, here's the difference. In phallic stage, you are sexually active because you are curious, but in genital stage, your sexual desires are intense, and this time you want to this time the focus is now on the members of the opposite sex. It's not more of self-exploration, but this time it's about seeking a relationship with a special someone. And I want you to reflect on this theory. How will you describe his theory? Is it weird? Is it different? Is it unique? Okay, and reflect on the theory of Sigmund Freud and try to critique his views. That's it. Thank you.